Hey there. Tonight we're returning to a place built of stone and silence. It's not the kind of silence that soothes it, lingers, listens, and sometimes remembers. This is the story of 17 days, 17 impossibly quiet days in the life of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII. A queen once crowned in glory, now confined to rooms she used to rule. These aren't the days you'll find in most history books. These are the soft, shadowed hours that history left behind. If you enjoy drifting into history the gentle way where the echoes are soft and the pacing is slow, you're more than welcome to stay. Maybe even follow along if it feels right for you. And if you'd like to help this story reach others who need a calm moment, before sleep, feel free to leave a comment and share where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know which corners of the world we're quietly connecting tonight. So now take a deep breath, and let's begin. You open your eyes to the pale gold of candlelight bouncing off carved stone. The scent in the air is strange part beeswax, part rosewater, and something cooler like old velvet left too long untouched. The room is larger than you imagined, with high wooden beams and thick tapestries on the walls. It's not a prison. Not quite. And that's what makes it harder to grasp, because this is not a room made for punishment. It's a room made for queens. You've been here before. Or rather, she has. 3 years ago, this very chamber was filled with joy, silk, and song. Anne Boleyn had prepared here for her coronation, a moment when she was not yet a cautionary tale, not yet the symbol of a kingdom's cruelty, but simply a woman who had reached the summit of her ambition. And now she's returned. But this time the silks are gone. The songs have stopped. And Anne is no longer allowed to walk these halls freely. It's not a fall from grace. It's a holding pattern before disappearance. The Tower of London, as you might expect, has many doors. But this one, the royal apartment, is reserved. Not for enemies, but for those once beloved. She isn't thrown into a damp cell. She's brought back into the very place where her power peaked, as if the building itself wants her to feel every echo. According to Sir William Kingston, the Tower's Constable Anne asked plainly upon arrival if she was to be placed in a dungeon. "No, madam," he replied gently. "You shall go into the lodging you had at your coronation." And she laughed. Not the kind of laugh that bursts from happiness, but something else entirely. Kingston recorded it carefully, noting that she fell into a great laughing, and had done so many times since. It unsettled him. This wasn't joy, it was something more fragile, more fractured. From the outside, it might be easy to assume Anne Boleyn fell like others, before her caught in some web of betrayal or scandal. But her situation was far more delicate, far more constructed, and far more chilling. She hadn't simply stumbled into misfortune. The net had been carefully woven around her thread by thread. Just days before her arrest, Anne had attended a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace. Sitting in the royal box, she dropped her handkerchief, a customary gesture of favor toward a knight. It was a small traditional act, but King Henry VIII saw it, and instead of interpreting it as politeness or ceremony, he stormed out. Within 24 hours, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, treason, and other accusations that would later stretch into the unimaginable. Whether Henry had truly believed the worst, or had simply found a convenient excuse, historians still debate. What is certain is that the order for her confinement came before any trial or evidence. In many ways, the verdict came before the accusation. You trace your fingers along the edge of the stone fireplace, its soot marks still faint as though someone had wiped it clean in haste. The chair near the window hasn't moved since she last sat there. You can almost hear the rustle of her skirts. This isn't just a room. It's a memory dressed in furniture. You see, Anne was never a passive figure in history. That's what made her dangerous to some and magnetic to others. She was not born into the inner circle of royalty. Her family, the Boleyns, were influential, but new money rich in favor but not old blood. Anne had spent her youth in the courts of the Netherlands and France, where she learned not just languages, but the art of conversation, the subtle power of presence, and how to wear wit like armor. She wasn't classically beautiful. Even her critics admitted that. Some whispered of a sixth finger or a small blemish on her neck, though modern historians largely dismiss these as exaggerated slanders. But what Anne lacked in softness, she made up for in sharpness. Her eyes, they said, could pin a man like a hawk, and her voice, low, musical, and intelligent, lingered in memory long after the words faded. She was quite simply unforgettable, and for some, unforgivable. This wasn't a woman content with the margins. She wasn't a silent mistress or a timid wife. Anne challenged the status quo not just by becoming queen, but by questioning what queens were supposed to be. She supported the translation of scripture into English. She surrounded herself with reformist thinkers. She refused to be quiet, even in a court that preferred its women beautifully silent. But that sharpness, so captivating in the beginning, would become the very edge people feared. You take a slow breath. The room grows heavier with thought. This was not a place for reflection, not then. It was a place of performance. And now it's a place of reckoning. Tidbit for tonight. One of Anne's unusual gifts to Henry was a book of love poetry, written in her own hand with small hearts drawn beside certain lines. It's said she would flip to specific pages while handing it to him as if to underline her own message. Romantic, perhaps. Political, almost certainly. And that's the part so many forget. Anne didn't merely fall out of favor, she became inconvenient. After giving birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Anne suffered miscarriages. No living male heir followed. Henry, once enthralled, began to shift his gaze to someone quieter, Jane Seymour. Historians still argue whether Henry truly believed Anne guilty of the charges laid against her, or whether he simply accepted the stories built by his chief minister Thomas Cromwell, who had once been her ally but now saw her as a threat. Either way, the outcome was swift. And that's how she ended up here. Not dragged through the streets, not cast into some cold pit, but placed neatly into a royal suite surrounded by the echoes of her own rise. It's said that Anne paced these rooms often, that she would talk to herself in French, that she'd whisper questions no one could answer, and sometimes she would sit at the window and stare into the gray sky as if trying to find a shape in the clouds, an answer, a pardon, a sign. You close your eyes for a moment, imagining her there, a woman too intelligent to be dismissed, too outspoken to be safe, and too human to escape heartbreak. And as the candle flickers beside you, you feel something soft, almost tender in the air. Not fear, not even sorrow, just pause, a breath held by time. The tower, after all, remembers everything. You haven't moved much. The stone beneath your feet is cold but steady, and the air still carries that faint scent of dried lavender and beeswax polish. But something has shifted. Not outside the room, within it. You begin to notice what Anne surely must have noticed: she is not alone. Not really. The presence is quiet, refined, trained to disappear. But it's there in the rustle of skirts that do not belong to her, in the polite cough just outside the curtain, in the eyes that never quite look away. 4 women surround her. Not friends, not confidants, though they pretend to be. These are hand-picked ladies-in-waiting, assigned to keep her company, but more importantly, to report her every word. They were chosen by the King's Council, not by Anne herself, and they are not neutral observers. Among them is Lady Kingston, wife of the Tower's constable. Every sigh, every whispered prayer, every fractured monologue Anne utters is noted down and passed along. It is surveillance dressed in satin. At first, Anne tries to maintain her composure. She still speaks in full sentences, still holds herself upright the way she was taught at court. But over time, something begins to wear thin. She paces. She repeats questions. She laughs at things that are not funny. And she begins to speak aloud to no one in particular, as if trying to make sense of it all with no one she can trust to answer. The women nod politely, stitch in silence, then record every word. You walk softly toward the edge of the chamber, where one of the women once sat, embroidery and hand gaze, flickering to Anne's every move. The needle moved, but the mind took notes. Anne must have known. Perhaps that's why she sometimes exaggerated her gestures, or gave voice to thoughts she wanted recorded. She was many things, but never naive. There's something deeply personal about being watched like that, not by enemies with drawn swords, but by women in quiet dresses, offering tea, asking after your sleep, pretending to care. It's an invasion that feels almost too gentle to resist, but it's there every moment. Anne can't cry without it being noticed, can't whisper without it being written down. Tidbit for tonight, Anne's wardrobe, even in confinement, remained elegant. She still wore damask and fur-lined sleeves, not because she insisted on luxury, but because it was part of the image she had to maintain. Queens did not unravel in rags. They unraveled slowly, gracefully, hemmed in by formality. And yet even the finest gowns couldn't protect her from what came next. Anne begins to question her own memory. She hears things she can't place. She asks again and again whether her brother George is truly in the tower too. She wonders aloud whether her father has spoken in her defense. The answers never arrive, and when they do, they arrive incomplete. Kingston ever dutiful records that Anne once offered to have her body physically examined, to prove she had not done what they accused her of. She was that desperate. She was willing to be measured like evidence just to reclaim her innocence. Imagine that. A queen reduced to pleading not for justice, but for disbelief. The four women nod. They sew. They whisper behind doors. They report. Anne learns to live with it, or perhaps learns to pretend she doesn't care. You glance around the room again. The stillness is too perfect to be accidental. Even now it holds that feeling of eyes that used to linger just out of sight. You can almost feel the weight of unspoken judgment pressing against the tapestries. Historians still debate whether the women assigned to Anne were selected for their loyalty to the crown or for their known disapproval of her. Some believe they were chosen specifically to unsettle her, to remind her of the court's disapproval. Others argue they were simply available convenient choices. But either way, they were not chosen to comfort. And perhaps worst of all, Anne was too clever not to see it. She knew when she was being managed. She could hear it in the cadence of their questions, the way they wrote things down before she even finished speaking. So she began to lean into it, offering cryptic comments, absurd jokes, strange metaphors. Not madness, but a kind of theatrical resistance. Her own quiet performance. One day she says to Kingston, "I hear say, I shall be accused with 3 men, and I can say no more but nay unless I should open my body." The phrase is oddly clinical but cutting. It's the voice of someone who knows her voice has been taken, and so she speaks in riddles. It's all she has left. And the women, ever faithful to their role, report it. Every word. You begin to understand why this room feels so haunted, not with ghosts, but with a kind of exhausted alertness. The kind you feel when you've been pretending for too long, when your every move is calculated, not for freedom, but for how it will be remembered. Anne still eats at a small table alone, but observed. She still combs her hair, writes occasional letters, and sometimes sits for hours without speaking. But she is never alone, not really, and in that strange gilded isolation, a slow erosion begins, the kind that wears not on the skin, but on the soul. There's a phrase Anne is said to have used during these days. "If any man accuses me falsely, I pray God he may not have cause to repent it. It sounds simple, but in her voice it was a quiet warning. She knew reputations could unravel just as swiftly as hers had, and she knew the tower had long memory. Tonight's fact. Though Anne was officially charged with relations involving 5 men, the dates listed in the indictment placed her in different palaces or public events sometimes miles away on those very days. The inconsistencies didn't matter. The trial hadn't begun, but the decision had already been made. And so she waits. Not in chains, not in shadow, but in a room once lit for celebration, now dimmed for containment. You sit down in the same spot she once favored, near the window where the sky would change more often than the news. Outside she couldn't hear anything. No footsteps from the court, no word from her father, no whisper of her daughter, just the occasional cry of a raven and the never-ending whisper of silk moving through the halls behind her. The light through the window doesn't shift much these days. It's pale, filtered through thick cloud, and the lattice of iron that guards the glass. You sit where she sat day after day, watching a sky that never told her anything. And time, if you can call it that, moves differently here. There are no bells, no public prayers, no hallway laughter. Just the rhythm of footsteps outside the door, and the steady routine of waiting for something unnamed. Each morning begins with the same hush, the same faint knock on the door, the same tray-bred weak ale, sometimes fruit if the kitchens remember. She eats a little, not from hunger, but from habit. Then she waits, for what even she cannot say. Some days she expects someone to walk in with news. Other days she half hopes for nothing at all, because no news, even when cruel, still means she's alive. Anne Boleyn was never good at doing nothing. That may be one of the reasons she ended up here. She liked to act, to speak, to stir thought in others. Her mind did not idle. Even now, surrounded by watchers and suspicion, she reads aloud to herself snippets of psalms, lines of poetry, even old love notes she once kept tucked between book pages. It's as though she's trying to knit her own mind together with words, but words once her allies now echo back at her unanswered. Sometimes she asks to see her daughter, just once, just to know that Elizabeth is safe. But the request is never granted. No one dares respond directly, and that silence too becomes part of the routine. You notice how her movements grow slower, not weaker. Anne was not one to drift, but more deliberate. She wraps herself in old rhythms, brushing her hair exactly 100 times, arranging her sleeves just so, folding her hands with care. They are gestures of control in a space where she has none. There's something heartbreaking in that. The way the mind adapts finds order in limbo. She even keeps track of the days using a rosary, not because she seeks divine favor, but because counting is something she can still do. Tidbit for tonight, Anne requested her own prayer book, while confined a small volume of hours that she had previously gifted to one of her ladies. In it she had once written, "Remember me when you do pray that hope doth lead from day to day." Quiet, careful words, but now they return to her as if echoing across time. Historians still discuss whether Anne believed she would be released. Some suggest she held on to hope far longer than anyone around her. Others think she knew from the start, but refused to show it. After all, hope, like grief, wears many disguises. Each afternoon the pattern repeats. The watchers return. The guards outside shift. The air grows heavier, not with fear, but with tedium. Anne tries to read, but her eyes wander. She picks up embroidery, but can't thread the needle. Her hands are too still, and so she paces, back and forth, from fireplace to window. Each turn like the striking of a clock no one can hear. You imagine the hallway just outside. Guards posted whispering about her when they think she can't hear. Courtiers who once bowed deeply now walking past, without glancing toward her door. and behind closed doors in other parts of the tower, preparations that no one will speak of yet. Kingston always careful notes that she sometimes speaks as if someone invisible were in the room. Not madness, he says, but fatigue of the soul. She asks questions till the air pauses, then answers them herself, always with a tone that hovers between sarcasm and sorrow. It's the voice of someone who has had to become her own audience. And there's something else she does. Each night before the candle is snuffed, she sits at the foot of the bed and whispers to herself. Not prayers exactly, more like instructions. Phrases such as, "If it comes tomorrow, I must not tremble," or "My daughter will not remember this part," as though preparing herself not just for what's coming, but for how she'll be remembered. And perhaps that's the one thing she still holds on to the future. Not hers, but her daughter's. Elizabeth, just a toddler then, would never remember these 17 days, but Anne imagines that someday someone might tell her, might whisper in her ear that her mother faced it all with grace, that she didn't plead, that she stood firm, not because it would change anything, but because it matters to know. The sun outside begins to drop. Shadows lengthen across the tiled floor. Anne leans against the window and watches the darkness spread, not because it frightens her, but because it marks one more day past, one less day left in this strange waiting. Tonight's historical fact, Anne wasn't told the full list of accusations until just before her trial. In the days leading up to it, she only heard fragmented rumors, names, dates, offenses, but no coherent picture. It was part of the strategy. Confuse, exhaust, isolate. And so she guesses. She hears names whispered by servants. She overhears phrases through doors left slightly ajar. Mark Smeaton, George, Francis. She mouths the names, wondering which, if any, are true, and which are simply convenient. The tower does not echo loudly. Its stones are too old for that. But you can feel the weight of thought pressed into them like ink pressed into parchment. The fear doesn't shout, it waits. Anne doesn't cry much anymore. Not because she has no tears left, but because tears are too private to share with an audience that pretends not to be watching. And still she waits. You can hear the difference in footsteps when the day arrives. They're firmer, more deliberate, like the decision has already been made, and the rest is merely performance. No one tells Anne directly that her trial is today. She learns it by the change in the way the guards glance at her, by how the watching women grow even quieter, by how Kingston lingers just a moment longer before speaking. She's not given time to prepare. No official summons, no advance warning. Just a shift in the air and then a summons to stand. The royal apartments, though gilded in memory, offer no protection now. Anne leaves the chamber without ceremony, her movements precise as though every step might be judged. There is no crowd to see her off, just walls breathless and silent watching her descend. The trial is held in the King's Hall within the tower, a structure of thick stone heavy with cold, and occupied by faces Anne knows all too well. That's the strange cruelty of it. The men who sit in judgment are not strangers. They are not distant magistrates in robes. They are family, friends. Courtiers who once bowed to her, praised her wit, danced in her presence. And now they sit above her faces, measured lips pressed, prepared to play their roles. Among them is her uncle Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. He does not meet her eyes. Anne stands alone. There is no lawyer at her side. She hasn't even been informed of the specific charges in full until this very moment. As the accusations are read aloud, conspiracy, betrayal offenses of the heart and crown alike, she listens without flinching. It's not the first time she's heard rumors. But now they are codified, legitimized, written in careful ink as though repetition might make them real. The court does not call witnesses. No one is summoned to speak on her behalf. The men whose names are tied to hers are absent. Her defense is silenced not by choice, but by design. Tidbit for tonight. One of the peers who judged Anne that day was Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, a close friend of Henry VIII. He had once called Anne goggle-eyed, a cruel reference to her distinctive gaze. It's hard to imagine he left that prejudice at the door. You sit quietly near the back of the hall, close enough to feel the chill in the stones, far enough to watch without being watched. Anne stands with a dignity that isn't forced. It's practiced, refined, shaped over years at court. Even here in this theater of accusation, she holds her shoulders as if still wearing a crown. And yet around her the silence from familiar faces cuts deeper than any charge. Henry Percy, her former betrothed, is here. The man she was once expected to marry before politics tore them apart. He does not speak. Others from her father's circle sit nearby, eyes lowered, hands clenched. No one rises. No one objects. And in their stillness, Anne receives her answer. You wonder, as she must have, why. Perhaps some of them are afraid. Henry VIII is not a man to cross, especially not now. The king has already moved on in heart, if not yet in law. Jane Seymour waits quietly out of sight, but never out of mind. The machinery of court has realigned itself, and Anne is no longer its center. Or perhaps more painfully, some believe the stories, not because they're logical, but because they're useful. Believing makes it easier to let her go, to avoid asking hard questions, to preserve their own place in the world. And then there's family. Thomas Boleyn, her father, is notably absent from her defense. He does not speak out, write letters, or appear at court. He remains at a distance, his silence wrapped in duty or fear, or perhaps shame. Historians still debate whether he stayed quiet to protect his own status, or because he had already grieved her place at court, long before this trial began. And her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, pronounces the judgment himself, with the weight of the state behind him, and no visible struggle on his face. Some say he was cold by nature. Others think he was protecting his own lineage, distancing himself from a niece who had become a liability. But whatever his reason, his voice delivers the sentence. Anne, Queen of England, is declared guilty on all counts. You feel a breath catch in the room. Not hers, not the jury's, but the building's. As if the very stones realize something final has occurred, something irreversible. Anne does not collapse. She does not cry out. She offers no confession. Instead, she bows her head. A gesture not of defeat, but of farewell. Tonight's fact. The court claimed Anne had committed offenses on specific dates, when records show she was in entirely different places, attending royal events, traveling with the court, sometimes in the presence of dozens of witnesses. But no one challenged the timeline. The verdict, it seems, was preordained. Anne's silence in this moment isn't surrender. It's clarity. She understands perhaps better than anyone that this trial isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about conclusion, about resolution, about removing an inconvenient queen with as little disruption as possible. The irony isn't lost on her. She rose through wit and will by daring to imagine a different role for herself, in a world that never forgave women for ambition. She claimed her place beside the king not as decoration but as partner, and now she is being unseated, not for what she did but for who she dared to be. You look around the room and wonder who among these men will sleep peacefully tonight. Some likely, others perhaps not. But all of them will say they followed the law, the crown, the necessary path forward. And all of them will forget in time the woman who stood alone and unyielding in front of them. Historians still argue whether Henry truly believed she was guilty, or whether he needed her to be in order to justify what came next. The records don't offer certainty, only inference. And in that fog, Anne's truth is left to drift. After the trial, she is led back to her room. No applause, no ceremony, just footsteps and the whisper of fabric, and the echo of a sentence that has already begun to take root. Back in the royal apartment, the four women are waiting, their faces unreadable. Anne does not speak. She sits down at her usual place near the window. The sky, as always, offers nothing. You wonder if she remembers the faces from just days or weeks ago, the ones who called her brilliant, daring favored, the ones who once sent gifts and praised her Latin, her wit, her grace. You wonder if she still imagines them, wonders why they have vanished now, why they chose absence over loyalty. But if she does, she doesn't say. Her thoughts for now remain her own. The tower holds its breath once more, and 17 days continue. The days after the trial are quieter, not because the air is any softer or the chamber any warmer, but because something fundamental has shifted. The question is no longer, what will they decide, but rather, when will they act? You remain by the window, watching how the light changes along the floorboards. The wind outside carries the same scent of damp stone and spring. But here, in this borrowed space of royal comfort turned ceremonial prison, the world feels distant. You're not alone. Not exactly there are always eyes, but you've never felt more isolated. Anne asks after her family. It's not a dramatic plea, not some grand moment of tears or accusation. She simply inquires calmly, as one might ask whether the mail has come. Has my father sent word, she asks. Is my brother safe? The room grows still. No one offers an answer. In truth, her father, Thomas Boleyn, is keeping his distance. Once a calculating diplomat, he had benefited from Anne's rise, walking proudly beside her at court, even reaping titles from her marriage. But now he is silent. Some say he was trying to protect his remaining legacy, to avoid being dragged down with her. Others suspect he was quietly heartbroken, unsure how to navigate the collapse of the very path he helped construct. Historians still argue whether Thomas's retreat was cowardice or calculation. But Anne is left with neither his presence nor his support. And her brother George, he too had been arrested, accused of crimes that defied logic, swept up in the same charges used to dismantle Anne's world. Once her ally, witty and bold George Boleyn, is now kept apart out of sight, another piece removed from the board. The silence around him grows heavier by the hour. You start to realize the shape of Anne's loneliness isn't accidental. It's architectural. She didn't enter this world as a noble darling beloved by all. The Boleyns were a rising family, not a historic one. Their power was newly minted, their enemies many. Anne's sharp intelligence, her refusal to play the soft-spoken role expected of women, had made her a threat. At court, where smiles masked daggers and alliances shifted like sand, she made as many rivals as admirers. And now those rivals are watching, quietly satisfied perhaps, or cautiously waiting to see how far the king will go. Tidbit for tonight: Anne's own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, not only sat in judgment at her trial, but later reportedly claimed that he rejoiced in her downfall. A family celebration, if one can call it that, held not with banners and music, but with silence and compliance. Anne's friendships were never frivolous. She chose companions carefully cultivating influence with the wives of nobles, engaging in theological debates, even aligning herself with reformers who sought to reshape the church. But in the end, many of these connections proved fragile. When the tide turned, few stood by her, and perhaps most painfully, even those who once claimed to adore her men, who had courted her smile, who had praised her brilliance, who had relied on her favor, now vanished without a word. At court, the phrase, "every man for himself," isn't said aloud. It simply becomes the rule. The women assigned to attend Anne during these days, ostensibly, her maids serve also as informants. They note her every movement, her sleep patterns, her speech. Even the quietest whisper is recorded and passed along. Anne knows this. She sees it in how they exchange glances, how they pause just slightly after she finishes a sentence, as though waiting to file it away. And so she speaks less. She chooses her words like a queen, still shaping policy, even if her throne is long gone. You watch her retreat inward, not in defeat, but in self-preservation. There is a kind of elegance in how she folds into herself like a dancer, taking final position even after the music has stopped. It's tempting to imagine this as tragic a heroine abandoned in her final hour, but Anne isn't simply a victim here. She is also a symbol of ambition, of challenge, of disruption. She didn't fit the mold of the quiet consort. She was opinionated, political, fiercely intelligent. And to many in Henry's court, that made her dangerous. Some whispered she had bewitched the king. Others claimed she brought bad luck, that she was too French, too Protestant, too proud, that she spoke too freely, interfered too often, asked too many questions. The very traits that had once drawn Henry to her, her confidence, her mind, her independence, had now become her liabilities. And then there was the matter of the heir. Anne had promised Henry sons. That was the great gamble. But she gave birth first to a daughter Elizabeth, and then suffered miscarriages. The disappointment wasn't just personal. It was political. The stability of the Tudor line hung precariously on Anne's womb, and the court, always hungry for succession, began to murmur. When a king begins to look elsewhere, those murmurs become thunder. Historians still debate whether the failure to produce a male heir was the true tipping point, or whether Henry's heart had already moved on to Jane Seymour waiting quietly in the wings. But by the time Anne was confined to her apartments, the narrative had already been written. She was no longer the future. She was an error to be corrected, and corrections in Henry's world came swiftly. Even now, as she sits by the window, the pageantry of her past still clings to her in memory. The coronation robes the golden barge on the Thames, the crowds that had once cheered her name. All of it exists still, but only in her mind. The present offers none of it. No messengers, no notes, no father, no brother, no child. Tonight's fact Elizabeth, just 2 years old at the time, was moved to Hatfield House during her mother's confinement. She was declared illegitimate shortly after Anne's downfall, a status that would shadow her for years, even after she became queen. Anne asks once more if any letters have arrived. Kingston shakes his head, not cruelly, just efficiently. There's nothing, he says, nothing from court, nothing from her family. You wonder what Anne thinks of her absence from their thoughts. Does she believe they've given up? Or does she hold out hope that they're working quietly behind the scenes, preparing an appeal, a plea, a miracle? There's no way to know. And in the silence, that uncertainty becomes its own kind of torment. Evenings stretch longer now. The candles seem to burn more slowly, the air to weigh more heavily. The women around her speak only when necessary. You begin to sense how isolation becomes more than physical. It's spiritual. A dull ache that hums beneath every breath. And still Anne keeps her posture. She brushes her hair with steady hands. She reads from her book of hours. She speaks in soft, controlled tones. Because even in solitude, even in what seems like abandonment, there is a dignity that can't be taken. And perhaps that's the part her enemies never understood. They could strip her of title, accuse her in court, erase her name from records. But they couldn't write her out of history. Not entirely. Not when her story, painful though it was, would echo through generations. For now, though, the echo is still forming, and 17 days haven't yet passed. The 6th day arrives not with ceremony, but with a stillness so absolute it almost hums. You feel it before you see it, this strange, aching pause in the rhythm of things. There's no knock at the door, no change in the guards, no whispers exchanged at the edge of the chamber, just silence, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Anne had been told the end would come today. Not directly, of course. There was never an official pronouncement, no parchment signed in wax or parade of ministers. But the signs had been there. Kingston, the constable of the tower, had begun moving more deliberately. The chaplain had visited longer than usual. One of the women, Margaret Coffin, perhaps had gone pale the night before and wouldn't say why. These small changes, subtle though they were, signaled something. And so Anne prepared herself. She had risen early, taken care to arrange her hair, even chosen her gown with thoughtfulness, a simple gray soft at the cuffs, neither regal nor disheveled. She took communion, whispered prayers, touched the wooden edge of her small prayer book, with fingers that trembled only slightly. She was ready. But the morning passes, and then the afternoon, and the sun begins to lower its gaze over the tower, brushing gold over the edges of the windows, casting long shadows against the velvet-lined walls of her chamber. Still no one comes, no footsteps, no message, no change. The executioner, who had been summoned from Calais, famous for using a sword instead of an axe, is delayed. The crossing is slow. Perhaps the tides were unkind. Perhaps someone at court hesitated, just briefly allowing a few extra hours to slip between the royal will and the final act. Or perhaps it was simply the weather. In the end, no one tells Anne why the day stretches on unfulfilled. And in that gap, the cruelty blooms. Because this is no longer about verdicts or charges or kings. It is about the waiting. You watch as Anne sits again by the window, the sunlight now turned orange and tired. She clutches her sleeves. Her eyes dart less now. The questions have changed. Not will I be spared. Not even will anyone come. Instead it becomes simply, how long will they make me sit with this tonight's historical fact? Anne Boleyn's execution was originally scheduled for May 18th, 1536. But at the last minute, it was postponed by a day without explanation. She was told to prepare, and then told to wait. That delay has fascinated historians for centuries. Some believe it was a sign of the king's indecision, that perhaps Henry even then was weighing options. Others argue it was nothing more than poor planning, that the sword-bearing executioner from France hadn't yet arrived, and still others whisper that it was intentional. A final twist of the blade, so to speak, not literal but psychological. Because there's something particularly devastating about readiness denied, about waking with the knowledge that this may be your final sunrise, and then going to bed again with no closure, no end, just another night in limbo. Anne eats nothing that day, not out of protest, but because her stomach has clenched into something too tight to fill. She paces, then sits, then stands again. You notice how the women around her are quieter, even more restrained than usual. They too seem unsure of what to do with this suspended moment. There is no script for this part of the story, no protocol for how to handle a queen unqueened, but not yet gone. Tidbit of the evening. In an unusual show of courtesy, Henry had ordered a French swordsman, rather than the traditional English axe, a decision some believe was meant to be a mercy, as beheading by sword was quicker and more precise. Others suggest it was done for show to preserve a sense of foreign elegance, even in execution. The irony, Anne would spend longer waiting for the sword than she might have for the axe. The bells toll outside the tower, but they're for evening prayers, nothing more. The world moves on as it always does, even when you're not part of it anymore. And you begin to understand how isolation isn't just about walls or silence. It's about time itself turning soft around you, folding in on itself like damp parchment. Anne hums quietly that night. A lullaby, maybe. Or a hymn. It's hard to tell. The melody floats through the chamber, brushing against the tapestries, resting lightly on the wooden beams overhead. It isn't sad, exactly. It isn't hopeful, either. It's just present. Like breath. Like memory. Like the space between two moments that never quite connect. And you wonder, was this worse than a quick end, to be made to feel ready? To make peace? To write your thoughts, organize your belongings, say your prayers, only to be returned to the strange nothingness of waiting. There's a quiet sort of defiance in Anne's stillness that evening. She isn't weeping. She isn't pleading. She simply folds her hands in her lap and watches the moon rise. The light pools gently on the floor beside her. A sliver of calm in a room designed to unsettle. Historians still debate whether Anne knew the full scope of the king's betrayal, whether she believed until the very end that Henry might call it off. Some letters suggest she had accepted her fate. Others hint at flickers of hope. But whatever she believed, she never showed despair. Not outwardly. Not in the way her enemies might have expected. Instead, she endured the postponement with the same poise that once made her the most dazzling figure at court. That grace which once charmed Europe's most powerful men was now all she had left to wield. And maybe in a strange way, that's what makes this part of her story so quietly powerful. Not the drama, not the politics, but this waiting. This singular day meant to be her last, stretched unnaturally long like the final chord of a song, played too slowly, not grand, not tragic, just quiet and human. You watch her close her eyes, just for a moment, not to sleep but to gather herself, because tomorrow when it does come will be the real end. But tonight she is still here, still breathing, still remembering, still waiting. The morning returns not with the fanfare of royal processions or the scent of fresh herbs along the corridor, but with the hush of inevitability. There is no doubt today. You feel it in the briskness of the footsteps outside your chamber, in the final stillness of the women assigned to watch you. They no longer whisper as they once did. Their pens are still, their gazes softer. No one is pretending anymore that this is just another day. Anne rises before the summons comes, not because she's been told anything, but because she simply knows. There's a particular kind of clarity that arrives when all questions fall away. No more wondering about mercy. No more weighing possibilities. There is no rescue, no reprieve. Only this day offered without disguise, without theater, as if even the tower has grown too tired for cruelty. She dresses slowly, carefully. Her final choice is not grand, not the deep green she once wore at her coronation, not crimson or gold or cloth of silver, just a plain dark gray gown, high neck, long sleeves. She fastens each hook and ribbon with steady fingers. No lady's maid assists her. She no longer needs ceremony. The only embellishment is a small English gable hood, modest without jewels. The same style she once made fashionable, now reduced to its simplest form. And then she kneels by the wooden chair in the corner of the room. No grand altar, no audience, just her folded hands and the soft murmur of her breath. Her prayers are short, simple, and quiet. She does not pray for vengeance, nor for justice, only for courage and for her daughter. Because whatever history remembers, Anne Boleyn dies not as Henry's wife, but as Elizabeth's mother. The walk to the scaffold is short, just a few stone passages and a staircase. But somehow it feels long enough to become something else, a procession not of power, but of composure. Her steps are slow but steady. Her back is straight. And her eyes, though shadowed by the hood, do not dart or flicker. There is no struggle, no need for restraint, only presence. As she emerges into the pale May light, the courtyard seems to inhale. The scaffold has been set in a private space within the tower, away from the public gaze. Just a few selected witnesses, nobles' officers, a few servants of the court. No roaring crowds, no jeering, no applause. A curious fact, Anne was one of the very few in English history to be executed by sword rather than axe. The swordsman from Calais trained to strike with precision, and grace was said to be so skilled that his victims never felt the blow. He hid the weapon behind his back so they would not flinch. And in Anne's case, he had been instructed to act with speed, to give her no further waiting. She climbs the platform without hesitation. You notice the wind playing lightly at the edge of her skirt. It is not cold, but cool enough to carry the scent of the river and the early roses beginning to bloom along the tower gardens. Nature indifferent and blooming as always. Anne turns toward the small crowd and speaks, not with defiance, but with care. Her voice is clear, unwavering. She speaks of loyalty to the king. She asks for prayers for his soul and her own. She does not declare her innocence, nor does she admit guilt. She walks the tightrope of royal expectation one last time even here. This moment has sparked centuries of debate. Historians still argue whether her final words were purely political, designed to protect her daughter to secure favor even in death, or whether they were simply the last graceful act of a woman who refused to let cruelty dictate her legacy. Perhaps both. What's known is this: she forgave. She did not accuse. And she stood tall. Tidbit to note: one of the ladies assigned to her, possibly Lady Kingston, reportedly wept openly as Anne removed her hood and tucked away her long, dark hair. She had always worn it free before famously refusing the elaborate French headdresses in favor of simpler English styles. That small decision years ago had changed court fashion, and now, even in death, she shaped how others remembered grace. Anne kneels. She adjusts her position gently so her neck is bare. Her lips move another prayer. Perhaps the same one from earlier. Perhaps something for Elizabeth. Perhaps nothing at all. The swordsman calls to his assistant for a distraction. Bring me the sword, though it is already in hand, so that Anne looks away, not knowing when the blow will come. And then there is no scream, no flinch, no stumble, just silence. Then a single strike, clean, final. She does not suffer. It is over in an instant. The witnesses do not cheer. They bow their heads. Some say the chaplain muttered a verse. Others claim the birds did not sing that morning. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter. The story itself has a kind of truth, one befitting a queen who never got to be simply a woman. Anne's body is placed in an old elm chest, repurposed from arrow storage. No royal casket, no procession, just practicality. She is buried within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the tower's modest church. No monument, no name etched in stone. For years no one knew the exact spot, and yet she would not be forgotten. Because while one chapter ends quietly here, another was only just beginning. Not far away, a child plays in a guarded garden. A red-haired girl with sharp eyes and quick hands. She is too young to understand what has happened, too young to grieve properly, or ask questions. But in the years to come, she will carry a memory shaped, not by experience, but by silence. A ring will one day be found among her possessions, set with a tiny likeness of a woman and a child, beneath a hinged cover. A secret, a memory, a vow. And so we reach the soft close of Anne Boleyn's 17 days. But beyond the walls of the tower, history still turns. Stories ripple outward, and the echo of a broken crown begins to rise into legend. You don't hear the echo of the sword. Not really. What you hear instead is a silence so heavy it presses against the chapel walls, lingers in the corridors, and tucks itself into the folds of every remembered story that follows. That silence doesn't scream, it stays. Quiet, patient, unmoving. And yet somehow it reaches all the way to a guarded nursery, where a little girl, not quite 3 years old, clutches her doll by the window. You imagine the sunlight draping across her red-gold hair, her nose turned slightly toward the light. Elizabeth, the child left behind. She's too young to understand what just happened, too young to know the tower, or the scaffold, or why her mother never returns to court. But children understand absence. They understand the way adults stop saying certain names, how the air grows careful, how the lullabies change ever so slightly. And Elizabeth, though bright and inquisitive, learns very early that her mother's name is not one to say out loud. In time, her title disappears from the books. Her portraits are removed. Even her memory is carefully, deliberately folded away by those who fear it might cause unrest. Anne Boleyn is now considered never to have been queen at all. Her marriage to Henry VIII is declared invalid, her child labeled illegitimate. The royal lineage reshuffles itself as though she were a brief interruption in a grander, more acceptable tale. But what the world tries to erase a daughter quietly remembers. And not in rebellion, not yet. There are no speeches, no demands for vindication, just small personal choices, a particular style of sleeve, a fondness for French books, a preference for privacy. Over the years, Elizabeth becomes known for her brilliance, her calculation, her refusal to be ruled by any man. But tucked beneath the surface is something more tender, something harder to define. It begins with a ring. Sometime in her reign, Elizabeth commissions a small, intricate piece of jewelry, a locket ring. From the outside, it looks unremarkable gold, finely worked, bearing the Tudor rose and a clear-cut diamond. But hidden inside, beneath a secret hinged lid, are two miniature portraits. One is of Elizabeth herself. The other is believed to be Anne. We can't say with absolute certainty that the second image is Anne Boleyn. Historians still debate the likeness, noting the high cheekbones, the French hood, the long neck. But in absence of a signature or written confession, the ring becomes a whisper, a possibility, a daughter's private nod to a mother the world tried to forget. It wasn't the only whisper. Elizabeth's education had always been extraordinary, fluent in 6 languages, steeped in history and politics. But beyond the formality of her tutors, she kept certain books close. One of them, a small, worn volume of prayers, was said to contain notes scribbled in Anne's hand, given to her before the separation, preserved like a charm. A thread. You wonder what that felt like. Growing up, royal brilliant, yet always a step removed. Surrounded by portraits of her father, stories of his power, his new wives, his new heirs. Elizabeth had to walk carefully, and she did. She learned to charm, to dance, to debate, to write with both fire and subtlety. She learned how to inspire fear, but also how to comfort, to hold her face still when others broke. And when she finally came to power against odds so steep they bordered on mythical, she ruled alone. The Virgin Queen, unmarried, undistracted, unclaimed. Many say it was politics. Others say it was trauma. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the shadow of a mother executed for being inconvenient left its mark not in sorrow, but in steel. Elizabeth was not her mother's twin, not a repeat. But she never pretended Anne hadn't shaped her. There's something poetic, isn't there, in how legacy moves? Not as thunder, but as weather. You feel it slowly, in gestures, in choices, in the way a woman builds a kingdom around herself, and then dares the world to look away. A curious historical tidbit during Elizabeth's reign: no official biography of Anne Boleyn was ever published, not one sanctioned by court. But at the same time, her image began to drift back into conversation. Artists quietly sketched her likeness. Poets dropped her name in verse. And over time, the public began to remember not the trial, not the tower, but the woman who had once stood beside a king and dared to speak her mind. And that may be Anne's truest legacy, not simply being remembered, but being remembered differently. Today, a small plaque marks Anne's burial place in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. For centuries, her grave was unmarked, lost among others. But in the 19th century, during renovations, her supposed resting place was identified and commemorated. A modest stone, a name, a gesture. It's not much, not a grand tomb or marble effigy. But then again, perhaps that's fitting. Because Anne's story was never about monuments. It was about memory. About how some names, even when broken, still carry weight. About how some mothers shaped the world not through survival, but through what they leave behind. So now, as we close this chapter of 17 days, you feel it too, the hush, the quiet grief, the strange calm. Not everything was just. Not every question was answered. But Anne Boleyn is no longer just the fallen queen, the disgraced wife. She is a woman who lived, who dared, who lost, and who through her daughter endured. And beyond the tower, beyond England, other women waited in silence too. Other queens, other daughters, and their stories too carry that same quiet ache. But first, just one more breath. The room is quiet now. No footsteps, no muffled weeping from behind embroidered sleeves, no distant bell tolling the end of a chapter. Anne's voice has faded from the corridors, her name spoken only in cautious tones, if at all. But the story she belonged to, what she stood for, didn't vanish with her. It rippled outward, because for a brief moment in English history, Anne Boleyn represented something radical, a woman who wasn't just a wife, but a mind. Fluent in French and Latin, a patron of reformist scholars, a woman who brought new books into the court, and who debated with bishops over scripture. In her rise there was the shimmer of possibility that a queen could do more than stand beside a throne, that she might speak beside it too. And yet, all that shimmer was dulled by old fears, by political rivalry, by the relentless humming machinery of male inheritance and dynastic control. Anne wasn't condemned for her thoughts, not officially, but those thoughts made her dangerous, and danger in a court so carefully balanced on ego and lineage could never be tolerated for long. She didn't lose because she was wrong. She lost because she was alone. And perhaps that is the deepest ache that lingers. Not the trial, not the scaffold, but the distance between who she was and how she was remembered, between her mind and her myth, between the woman who read Erasmus and the woman reduced to a cautionary tale. Even now you wonder if she had been born in another time, if the world had bent just slightly differently, what might she have become? But history doesn't ask. It only records. And in that recording, something else quietly shifted. Anne's fate was not just a personal tragedy. It was a turning point in the political and legal consciousness of a kingdom. Because when a queen can be arrested without explanation, tried without defense, and executed without proof, what does that say about justice? In the years following Anne's death, whispers moved through England. Not all out loud and not all brave, but persistent. People began to look differently at the court, at the king, at what truth really meant in a world where truth could be edited by decree. Anne Boleyn didn't get a fair trial. She wasn't allowed to speak freely, to examine the evidence, to call witnesses. Her accusers were selected in advance, her sentence decided before her arrest. Her only real crime was failing to produce a living male heir, and even that wasn't her fault. Modern scholars still debate whether Henry truly believed the charges against her, or simply needed her gone to make room for Jane Seymour. Either way, the effect was the same. The process, once invisible to most, became suddenly clear. You didn't need to be guilty. You only needed to be inconvenient. And that knowledge changed something. Later queens would fall too. Catherine Howard, Jane Grey. But each time more eyes watched. More doubts crept in. More people began to ask, where does power end and tyranny begin? There is a curious legal tidbit here, easy to miss. Just a few decades after Anne's death, English courts began to codify rules of evidence more formally. The idea of due process, of presumption of innocence, began to take root. Not perfectly, not always for women, but the seeds were there. And though no one can say Anne's case directly caused this shift, it hovered in the background, a cautionary ghost, a reminder that unchecked authority, no matter how divine it claims to be, can bleed justice dry. Historians still argue whether Anne's downfall was more political than personal, whether her enemies were threatened by her ambition or simply by her womb. But it was this very ambiguity that made her story stick. Because once England saw how fast a queen could fall, it couldn't unsee it. Even in the art of the time, you notice it. Paintings grow darker, eyes more cautious. The language of reverence becomes tinged with fear. Behind every flattery, a careful step. By the reign of Elizabeth, this wariness had matured into calculation. She too would use silence as a weapon. But she learned it from a world that had watched her mother be silenced in the most final way. The idea that even a queen is not safe reshaped the monarchy itself. It taught rulers to guard their alliances more tightly, and courtiers to tread more softly. It introduced the possibility that justice was no longer a given, but a performance. And performances, as you know, can be rewritten. You can almost hear it, the rustle of parchment, the quiet scraping of a quill. A clerk recording charges he doesn't understand. A judge reciting a sentence he did not write. A woman standing still, her hands folded, waiting for the page to turn. And in that stillness you feel the shift. Anne Boleyn's story is no longer just about one woman's fall. It's about the system that allowed it, and the slow, stubborn birth of resistance. As England tiptoed into the age of reform and revolution, her name remained tucked in its memory. Not loud, not honored, but present. And when someone asked decades later whether the law could be trusted, another would say, "Remember the Queen who never got a chance." So yes, Anne's chapter ended beneath gray skies and stone walls. But what she stood for, education reform, independence, outlasted her. It wasn't her voice that carried them forward. It was the echo of her silence. And now, as we step beyond the shadow of the tower, other stories await. Stories with familiar patterns, different queens, different countries, but the same quiet ache of injustice, wrapped in velvet and lace. Because Anne Boleyn wasn't the only one. You might have thought, as many did at the time, that Anne Boleyn's 17 days in the Tower were a unique storm, an unprecedented unraveling of a queen's reign, under the weight of royal paranoia, factional jealousy, and personal betrayal. But history has a habit of echoing, and this echo bore the name Catherine Howard. She was young, too young, some whispered when she caught Henry's gaze. Just a teenager, likely 15 or 16 when she arrived at court, with the charm and vivacity that made her a natural centerpiece of any room. Unlike Anne, who was sharpened by her education and the political edge of her family's ambition, Catherine's brightness was soft and unguarded. She wasn't groomed for queenship. She danced into it. But Henry, now aging, ailing, and increasingly desperate to recover the image of his golden youth, saw in her a chance at rebirth. She was his rose without a thorn, he said. And for a brief, glimmering moment, she might have believed it too. The marriage was swift, public, and filled with fanfare. But court watchers more practiced now could read the warning signs. Whispers clung to Catherine like perfume past romances. Loose supervision in her early years. Too many eyes had seen too much. And in a court that had already seen one queen fall for whispers alone, it didn't take much to stir the embers again. And so, one November morning in 1541, Catherine was escorted to her quarters under heavy guard. Not a prison cell, not yet, but confinement all the same. There would be no formal arrest for days, no charges read, but the message was clear. The music had stopped. Her situation bore eerie similarities to her cousin Anne's. Both accused of betraying the king's trust. Both watched over by attendants whose true role was to report, not to comfort. Both separated from the outside world by thick stone walls and even thicker silence. But where Anne had entered the Tower as a political figure at the heart of religious reform, Catherine entered with little more than her charm, and with far fewer allies. As she sat perhaps on a narrow wooden stool in a chamber, too grand for its purpose, she must have sensed the truth that everyone else already understood. History wasn't repeating itself. It was continuing with her as its next reluctant verse. The formal investigation that followed was brutal in its efficiency. Catherine's past was examined, dredged, and documented. Interrogations followed of her former lovers, her household, even the ladies who once helped her dress. It became clear very quickly that the goal wasn't clarity. It was justification. A strange tidbit from the records during one of her initial confessions, Catherine asked if the king would spare her life if she agreed to retire to a convent. It was an innocent request, almost childlike. But by then, mercy was no longer fashionable. Her official arrest came weeks later. She was moved to Sion Abbey first, then eventually to the Tower. And unlike Anne, who had time only to grieve and compose herself, Catherine had days and days of quiet dread. She paced, she prayed, and according to some accounts, she cried out at night, not just for her life, but for forgiveness. Her trial, if it could be called that, was conducted by the Privy Council. She was never allowed to speak in her own defense. Instead, a bill of attainder was passed, meaning Parliament declared her guilty without the need for legal proceedings. It was once again legality masquerading as justice. Historians still debate whether Catherine Howard was truly guilty of the accusations brought against her. Some argue she had engaged in inappropriate relationships before marriage, but none during. Others believe her youth made her an easy scapegoat, a sacrificial offering to the god of royal dignity. And what of her family? The powerful Howard clan that had once helped Anne ascend. Many distanced themselves. Some were arrested. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, survived, but only by condemning her publicly. No one stood by her side. On the morning of her death, February 13th, 1542, Catherine reportedly asked for a block to be brought to her chambers the night before. Not out of morbid curiosity, but so she could practice laying her head upon it. It's a heartbreaking image, a teenage girl rehearsing her own silence. She was buried beside Anne in the same chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, in the Tower. No grand tomb, no plaque until centuries later. Just a name slowly fading. And still her story wasn't truly about love or even betrayal. It was about fragility, about how quickly joy could become evidence, and youth become a liability. Catherine Howard's 17 weeks were quieter than Anne's 17 days, but no less devastating. The echoes of Anne's fall were not distant thunder. They were drumbeats beneath the court's floorboards. And Catherine's fate proved the rhythm continued, whether or not you dared to dance. And as we leave her story, we return once more to that quiet truth, that within the walls of royal palaces, innocence is rarely protection, and history does not hesitate to write over women's lives, with conclusions drawn long before the ink dries. You might think that the story ends once the curtain falls, but history isn't a tidy play. It echoes. It reverberates across marble halls and narrow cells alike. And as the dust of England settles behind you, a very different palace rises in the distance Versailles. But this time not as a place of splendor. Not tonight. You've just stepped into the worn footsteps of Marie Antoinette, whose own royal tragedy mirrors Anne's in chilling harmony. Only here the candlelight isn't perfumed. It flickers against stone walls, barely keeping the dark at bay. You remember the gilded mirrors and endless corridors of Versailles, don't you? The salons filled with powdered hair and fans orchestras echoing under crystal chandeliers. Once Marie was the queen who twirled through it all in gowns so wide she couldn't walk through doors. But all of that has vanished now. You're no longer in a place where courtiers bow and whisper. You're in the conciergerie, a drafty old section of what was once the royal palace, now turned prison. Marie is here, not as a queen, but as prisoner 280. And strangely, this setting feels crueler than the Tower ever did. The room is narrow, the walls damp. The bed, if you can call it that, is a straw mattress thrown on the floor, still imprinted from the prisoner, who laid there before. There's no privacy. A guard watches her day and night, sometimes even two. Her meals are plain broth and old bread eaten under surveillance. And yet, it's not the cold or hunger that weighs on her. It's the knowing. You see, Anne had 17 days of waiting. Marie had months. She watched the monarchy crumble around her brick by brick, as the revolution's firestorm tore through everything she once knew. Versailles became a symbol of excess, and Marie a target, plain and simple. Historians still argue whether she ever truly grasped how far her world had fallen. Some believe she remained defiant until the end. Others say she broke long before the final verdict. But tonight you don't see a defiant queen or a villain. You see a woman, one who once loved music and pastries, whose only crime, at least in public perception, was being foreign fashionable and conveniently hated. She didn't start the revolution, but she became its scapegoat. In her final cell, she clutches a letter that was never sent. It's written to her sister-in-law, the only woman she trusted after her husband's death. The paper is smudged, tears possibly. The ink is faint in places where her hand trembled. She writes not of fear, but of her children. Her son separated from her, indoctrinated, to forget her. Her daughter too young to understand. Live for them, she pleads. Tell them I love them always. Now pause. Let yourself feel the air in this place. It's not heavy with incense or perfume. It smells of mildew and dust. Somewhere above, a bell tolls the hour. Marie doesn't flinch. She's past that. In her final hours, she performs one last ritual, not for show, but for herself. She takes a small knife, not sharp, just enough, and cuts away her hair. Thick blonde curls fall to the floor in silence. Why to fit the cap of the guillotine more easily? No fuss, no drama. Just one quiet gesture that says, I know what's coming. That image of a queen kneeling beside her own severed curls lingers longer than any portrait in Versailles. It's not an act of vanity. It's a final reclaiming of dignity. There's a stillness here that you recognize. The same stillness Anne wore on her final morning. That strange kind of grace like a hush before snowfall. Marie dresses plainly. White gown. Simple shoes. No jewelry, no ribbons. The woman who once wore diamonds the size of grapes now walks the stone corridor with bare wrists. And when she steps outside, the city isn't quiet. It roars. But she walks through it like mist already halfway elsewhere. There's a famous account written by a guard of how she tripped on the way to the scaffold. Not dramatically, just a stumble. She looked up at the executioner and almost apologetically whispered, "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." That's what people remember. Not a scream, not a defiant speech. Just a queen apologizing for stepping on someone's foot. Of course, history has a strange sense of humor. The very room where she was tried barely a few weeks earlier used to be a royal audience chamber. Imagine that. The same velvet chairs now sagging. The gold leaf frames still gleaming faintly under prison torches. But this time no courtiers sit in them. Just jurors. Men who've already made up their minds. They accuse her of nearly everything, extravagance, treason, even worse. And she denies them all calmly. But there's one moment that even hardened revolutionaries pause at, when they accuse her of something truly cruel involving her own son. Marie gasps, then regains composure and says only, "If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge made to a mother." It is the one moment the courtroom goes still, and still, it changes nothing. Historians still argue whether the trial was ever meant to succeed. Some say her fate was sealed the moment the monarchy fell. Others believe that had she shown remorse, or disappeared into quiet exile, she might have survived. But most agree on this: her public image was so carefully vilified that by the time she stood trial, she was no longer seen as a person, but a symbol. That's what makes this echo so haunting. Like Anne-Marie was undone not by what she did, but by what people believed she represented. Foreignness, femininity, power not quite in the right shape, and of course timing. History can be ruthless about timing. But even in this there's a strange poetry, a quirky tidbit even. Do you know the guards tasked with escorting her on her final walk noted how silent the crowd became as she passed? Not angry, not cheering, just quiet. As if some part of them recognized that whatever she had been, what stood before them now was simply a human being, fragile, pale, and oddly brave. You walk beside her now, not out of pity, but understanding. The same chill that once crept down Anne's spine follows you now through the Parisian fog. Another queen, another morning. Another farewell that should never have been. But unlike Anne-Marie, never had a daughter to remember her. Her son was turned against her, her legacy buried in revolutionary slogans. And yet, her story survived, in letters smuggled out, in sketches drawn from memory, in that quiet apology on the scaffold. As you step out of the conciergerie's heavy doors and leave the gray stones behind, there's a moment of breathlessness, as if you've just walked through something sacred, or at least something real. No velvet, no tiaras, just the cold, beautiful truth of one woman's final day. And like Anne's, it matters not for its drama, but for its quietness. Now the mist thickens again, but this time the footsteps you follow lead east, not west. The language changes. The robes shift from silks to hanbok. You're walking not toward a palace, but toward a memory almost erased, toward a queen nearly forgotten, but not tonight. You think the quietest erasures are often the hardest to notice, because they leave behind no sound, no dust, no paper trail, no speeches to analyze, no famous paintings left to hang in memory, just absence. A name once spoken in the courts of two empires, now stilled as if it had never belonged to anyone at all. And as you ease into the soft shadows of this next room of history, it feels different somehow, like walking into a space that was once locked the key, hidden for decades. She was born Min Jae-young in 1851, a daughter of a once respected but financially diminished aristocratic family, in the kingdom of Joseon, what you now know as Korea. No one expected her to become queen, least of all herself. But fate, as it often does with women in power, had sharp turns. At age 16, she was chosen to wed King Gojong, mostly because court officials assumed she would be easy to control. They were wrong. She was brilliant, educated, and politically shrewd, perhaps too much so for the liking of those around her. In the gilded hush of Gyeongbokgung Palace, she made her intentions clear. No, she would not be quiet. No, she would not be a placeholder for male ambitions. And no, she would not stand by as foreign interests carved up her country, like a roast at a state banquet. She read newspapers in Chinese, wrote letters to Russian envoys, and entertained scholars and political reformers in her private quarters. And while that may sound ordinary now for a woman of her time and station, it was revolutionary. Her enemies called her many things: meddling, dangerous, ambitious. But what they feared most was that she understood the game better than they did. And she did. She had no crown jewels of Versailles, no tapestries bearing her initials like Anne. Her power came from intellect and strategy. She played regional powers against each other, resisting Japanese influence while courting Russia and China. And in doing so, she became a threat. Not because she wanted war, but because she refused to surrender without a voice. And then, just like that, her name disappeared. On a still morning in October 1895, Japanese agents and collaborators entered Gyeongbokgung disguised as guards. Their target, the Queen Consort. The rest, historians say, was so violent that it was left out of official records. What is agreed upon is that Min Jae-young was never seen again. The court claimed she had fallen ill. No funeral was held. No tomb marked her name. For nearly a decade afterward, she was referred to only as that woman in royal records, as if her presence had been too disruptive to remember and too powerful to admit. You sit with that for a moment, the idea of being erased not just from power, but from memory itself. There is something more chilling about that than any trial or cell, because at least Anne and Marie had their last words recorded, their portraits preserved, their tears catalogued into history. But Myeongseong had only silence. Her story lived on in whispered recollections, in passing comments from American missionaries and Russian diplomats who had once visited her court. One such account comes from a woman named Isabella Bird Bishop, a British explorer who described the Queen's dignity and intellectual curiosity in her memoirs. Another came from a Japanese general who years later confessed in a letter that what had happened in the palace that day was so horrific, even the perpetrators struggled to speak of it again. And then somehow she began to return. Not in power, of course, but in print. Quietly, her name began to reappear in old dispatches. American journalists who had once visited the court dug out their notebooks. A Korean court lady, long in hiding, released an oral account of what she witnessed. And slowly, like ink soaking into old parchment, Myeongseong began to re-enter the story. You see her again now, not as a shadow behind a screen, but seated before a writing desk in silk robes, fingers ink-stained, eyes sharp. You watch her compose a letter in Hanja to a Russian official, warning him of impending threats. You see her reading aloud to her attendants from Chinese poetry, and then laughing softly at a joke only someone well-read would understand. Historians still debate whether she was too provocative, too willing to challenge Japanese ambitions head-on, and too reliant on foreign alliances that never fully protected her. Some argue she misunderstood the limits of her own influence. Others believe she knew exactly what she was doing, and that her disappearance was proof that she had gotten far too close to turning the tide. But perhaps it doesn't matter which side you take, because the fact that you're hearing her name again, Myeongseong, is a kind of quiet victory, and maybe that's what matters most. That voices taken from history don't always stay gone. That even in cultures where women were kept from public life, one voice properly recorded can outlast an empire. There's a small museum now in Seoul in a preserved Hanok house that displays her hairpin, a copy of her letters, and a replica of the gown she may have worn in her final weeks. It's a quiet place, no grand banners, just glass cases, soft lighting, and silence. But if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear the rustle of silk skirts, the scrape of a calligraphy brush, and the kind of sigh that carries centuries of restraint. There's something deeply human about the way we remember women like her, not as saints or villains, but as complicated people caught in the tide of empire. And as you prepare to step into the next story, you carry something with you, not just her memory, but the knowledge that remembering can itself be a form of justice. You've now walked beside queens who stood in gilded halls, and those who vanished behind palace screens. And next you'll meet a woman who fell not from politics, but from the unraveling of a family, a mother, a Tsarina, and a woman who wrote her worries by lamplight in exile, not knowing which morning would be her last. You might think exile would bring silence, but silence in captivity is not the silence of peace. It's a different kind entirely. It's the kind that hums through thin walls, leaking past bolted doors, pressing its weight into the backs of your shoulders, as if it's trying to remind you every second that this is not your home. And in the town of Tobolsk, where the snow swallowed every sound but the scratch of a pen or the creak of old floorboards, that silence became the constant companion of Alexandra Feodorovna, the last Tsarina of Russia. You wake to the soft hiss of wind against the glass. It's February, and the frost paints the windows with branching silver ferns. The room is cold, too cold for royalty, and the walls once painted in gold are replaced by bare timber and thin plaster. You reach for your woolen shawl before rising from the creaky iron bed. Not because you care how it looks, but because your joints ache in this cold. And there's no servant left to light the fire. Gone are the silk slippers, the painted fans, the German chocolates and French perfumes. Now your hands are dry and cracked from washing clothes. You have to sew your daughter's dresses yourself and help your husband carry water in from the icy courtyard. Every bucket reminds you just how far the empire has crumbled. You were once the empress of nearly 130 million souls. Now you are just Alexandra, and no one here says Your Majesty anymore. They still call this place the governor's house, but it's a prison by any other name. You are allowed outside once a day to walk in a snow-drifted courtyard, ringed with boards and guards. The guards are young, too young to understand what you once meant to Russia, but old enough to resent the idea of monarchy. Some snicker when you pass. Others avert their eyes. You can't blame them. You can barely look at yourself anymore. And yet, you write. Each night by oil lamp, with your back hunched against the draft, you scribble on scraps of paper. Letters to your sister in Germany, to your cousin, the Queen of Romania, to anyone you think might listen. But the letters are never sent. You know this. You write them anyway. It's not about reaching anyone. It's about not losing your voice. You even keep a diary now, not just your thoughts, but also recipes, little prayers, reminders, to teach Anastasia how to hem a collar properly. Anything to keep the hours soft and full. Your husband Nicholas tries to remain calm, but the truth is written in his shoulders. They slope now. Once he stood like a statue, tall and inflexible, but the revolution has worn him down. He no longer reads state papers, only novels. He shaves less often. Sometimes you catch him staring into the window long after night has fallen, as if he's hoping to see a world he recognizes reflected back. But there's nothing there except the vague flicker of lamplight and his own thinning silhouette. There's a moment you recall still vivid even now. You had set the dinner table just 6 plates, and Maria whispered to you asking if they should say grace like they used to. You nodded. It was a small thing, a tiny, almost silly act of routine. But that moment hands held heads bowed in a room lit by only one bulb, and guarded by rifles. It brought a calmness none of you expected. It reminded you that you were still a family, that even stripped of jewels and titles you had each other. Of course, history would not let you stay in Tobolsk. Spring came, and with it orders. You are moved again, this time to Yekaterinburg. The journey is long, clattering, uncertain. You're separated from friends. Some of your luggage is confiscated. Anastasia cries quietly into her coat, and Alexei, your youngest, asks again if the palace will still be there when they go home. No one answers. Yekaterinburg offers no illusions of dignity. The house called Ipatiev House, though its real owners have long vanished, is narrow, dim, and heavily guarded. Curtains are drawn at all hours. Windows are painted over with whitewash. You are told it is for your safety. But even Alexei knows better by now. Here your world narrows even further. The guards are coarser. Some make cruel jokes. Others sneak your daughter's glances that make your skin crawl. You learn to keep them close, always within reach. The meals are meager, and the bath water when it comes is brown. The walls seem to inch closer every day. You learn not to talk too loudly. You take to whispering prayers with the children before sleep. And still you write. The tidbit that survives from these days is one of heartbreaking tenderness. A note carefully written and tucked into a prayer book reads simply, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." Historians still argue whether it was written in defiance or resignation. Perhaps it was both. You were never known for soft words, but here at the edge of history you began to fold into quiet. It is in this house, under flickering bulbs and thickened silence, that you begin to feel yourself disappearing. Not dying, no, not yet, but being erased. Stripped slowly of title role identity. One morning you glance in the mirror and see not a Tsarina, but a woman in a plain blouse, hair pinned back, eyes circled with fatigue. Alexandra, the daughter of a duke. Alexandra, wife of a dethroned man. Alexandra, mother of 5. At night, when the children sleep, you pace. Not far there isn't room, but enough to loosen the thoughts tangled in your chest. You think about Germany, about your English cousins, about how you once hated public appearances so much that you would weep after court banquets. You think about how you clung to Rasputin when no one else could cure Alexei, how they blamed you for everything war, famine, weakness. But they never saw the hours you knelt beside Alexei's sickbed, your hands pressed to his fevered skin, whispering psalms until dawn. You think, too, about the crown, heavy even when metaphorical. You had worn it with certainty once, believed truly that God appointed kings and queens. That duty came before happiness. That sacrifice was holy. But now, watching your daughters mend socks in silence, you wonder if the price was too high. If maybe you were wrong about some things. History doesn't often allow queens that kind of reflection. But exile is a slow teacher. One morning you wake to a sudden clamor. The guards are shifting. Whispers fill the hallway. You catch only fragments orders. Final. Tonight. You don't ask questions. You help the girls dress. You lace your boots. You make your bed with care. There's a quiet understanding between you all now. No panic. Just a hush, like the world holding its breath. And when you are told to gather in the cellar for your own protection, you go. Not because you believe them, but because resistance would cost your children too dearly. The room is small, damp. A single bulb hums overhead. Nicholas stands beside you. Olga clasps your hand. Alexei is brought down last, pale and tired, and you help him to the chair. You straighten his collar. You whisper a prayer. And then time folds. There are footsteps. A voice reading something official, but no one hears it. The silence once your tormentor returns one final time now as a shield. It mutes the noise, swallows the panic, holds you together until the very last moment. You are not forgotten. Not entirely. In the years that follow, fragments of your life are found notes hidden in books. Embroidery samples, diaries etched in faded ink. One soldier remembers how you kissed your son's forehead. Another recalls your insistence on serving food to your daughters, first even in captivity. They are small things, quiet things, but they endure. Historians still argue whether your execution was an act of revolutionary necessity or a needless cruelty. Some say it ended an era. Others say it began one. But here in this story, whispered into the soft dark, you are not just the last Empress of Russia. You are a mother, a woman, a figure of grace beneath unbearable weight. And the silence you once feared, it has become your echo. You arrive at the edge of another empire, not a cold one like Russia's, but steeped in incense, lacquered silence, and 1,000 silken secrets. This time you don't find yourself in a stone prison or candlelit chamber. No, you are inside the forbidden city, where gold roofs gleam like dragon scales, and every door whispers the footsteps of women who've outlasted dynasties. Here, surrounded by painted screens and ritual stillness, lives Empress Dowager Cixi, the woman who would not be forgotten. You don't meet her at the beginning of her rule, nor in the zenith of her power. No, you step into her presence at the end. The world around her has changed. The court is quieter, the Western suits more frequent. She's no longer the young concubine who bore the emperor a son and rose through cunning alone. Now she is a grandmother, with silver-threaded hair robes, heavy with symbols and a mind sharpened by years of survival. And she knows something the others didn't. History is not written by the loudest, but by the most prepared. Cixi's world was not one of immediate loss, like Anne's or Alexandra's. No, hers was a long and deliberate unfolding. Her health had begun to falter. Her fingers, once so deft at calligraphy, now trembled when she dipped her brush. Yet every day she summoned her secretaries, dictated careful notes, and ensured that her image, her chosen image, would outlive the whispers. This was not ego. This was strategy, After decades of ruling from behind a curtain, she knew precisely how fragile memory could be. You watch as she leans over a scroll, her eyes narrowed, not with age, but with calculation. She doesn't pen romantic stories of court life or sweet lullabies to power. No, she writes edicts, compiles foreign correspondence, annotates diplomatic gifts. There are boxes stacked, tied, labeled, not just with policies, but with letters, clothing fragments, even hairpins. Every object tells a story, and Cixi intends to decide how that story will be heard. Outside the palace, gardeners rake the sand into swirling patterns. It's a performance for no one really, but Cixi notices. She always notices. She is preparing for a time when her voice will no longer echo in the throne room, but in libraries and classrooms. And she isn't leaving that task to anyone else. Of course, the narrative she weaves isn't without its omissions. She does not dwell on the eunuchs punished for whispering rebellion. She skirts lightly around the Boxer Rebellion and the long, strange partnership she struck with German military advisors. And she rarely mentions Guangxu, the nephew emperor she supported, then marginalized, then some say poisoned, though historians still argue whether that was truly her order or a decision made by her loyalists in the final blur of power. Still, it would be a mistake to view her legacy only through the prism of control. You see, Cixi was not afraid to learn. She brought in Western technologies trains, telegraphs, mining machinery, not out of fascination, but survival. She funded modern schools for women, introduced postal reforms, and even allowed for newspapers. Slowly, so slowly you almost miss it. China under her watch began to look less like the sealed empire of painted fans, and more like a nation with one foot forward. And yet she remained cloaked in tradition. No one saw her face directly unless summoned. Her meals, often 30 dishes or more, were first tested by silver chopsticks for poison. Her court maintained strict hierarchies, elaborate rituals, and the exacting pace of dynastic timekeeping. But underneath it all pulsed a quiet urgency. She was running out of time. There's a moment quiet, almost nothing, when she dismisses her attendants and sits alone. You're there. You watch her open a worn letter written decades ago in a hand that once trembled with affection. A letter from the emperor who had chosen her, or perhaps used her. She does not weep, but her lips purse, and she folds the letter back into its pouch, like a flower placed gently into soil. Then she lights incense, not the thick ceremonial kind, but something soft rosewood and sandalwood. She breathes deeply. Before her passing, she calls for the imperial painters. She commissions one last portrait herself in formal regalia, seated, not smiling, but not cold either. The hands, those aging, decisive hands, rest on her knees with palms open. She ensures it will be displayed not in the grand hall, but in the smaller southern pavilion, just visible enough to be remembered, not grand enough to provoke rebellion. And then the day comes. She doesn't fight it. She wears her robe with phoenix embroidery, a soft violet underlayer visible at the collar. She takes only rice porridge that morning, served from a celadon bowl she'd used as a girl. And when the final breath leaves her, according to the court records at the hour of the dragon, there are no tears. Only a drawn curtain, and a world that hesitated before moving forward. What she leaves behind is not a broken crown or bloodied legacy. Instead, she leaves behind trunks of dictated stories, a network of modernized institutions, and most importantly, ambiguity. Was she a reformer masked as a conservative manipulator who protected her people through strategy, or simply a woman who saw what happened to queens who left no records behind? Long after her death, scholars would debate her role. Some Western writers painted her as cruel, vain, and obstructionist. Others, especially in later years, began to see the complexity. A woman born without rank who outlived emperors and rebellion, who ensured her story couldn't be erased, not because she shouted, but because she wrote. And perhaps that is the most radical act of all. In a palace of shadows and whispers, she made her voice known, not in life, but in the margins of history where silence used to live. Now, as the last notes of stringed guzheng fade into dusk, and you rise from her chamber, you carry with you not grief, but clarity. The power to define your own memory may be the last true crown anyone wears. Sixi's lesson, unlike so many others, was not in how she fell, but in how she planned to remain. And as you cross the carved threshold out of her court, the stone lion beside the gate seems to smile, not with fangs, but with memory. You might think a name can fade as quickly as a whisper, especially one carried by a woman who left the world with her hands tied, her voice silenced and her story warped by the victors. But Anne Boleyn's name didn't disappear. It lingered, not loudly, not defiantly, but steadily woven into the quiet corners of history, kept alive not by monuments or triumphs, but by the smallest, softest fragments that refused to vanish. It began in the most unlikely places in embroidery and jewelry, in marginalia scribbled between lines of theology or foreign correspondence. That bee necklace, the one you remember from portraits, it never officially resurfaced. But replicas appeared quietly across time, reinterpreted, echoed, worn by women who likely never knew the full truth behind the letter, but somehow felt drawn to it. Centuries later, it would become a subtle symbol, not of seduction or ambition as her enemies once claimed, but of survival, of voice. Anne's Book of Hours, those devotional pages she read while imprisoned, holds two messages. One is her own handwritten on the back flyleaf, offering a prayer for mercy. The other, far more haunting, is scribbled by her daughter Elizabeth, decades later, a single Latin phrase written in the same book. Remember me when you do pray that hope doth lead from day to day. A daughter who could not remember her mother's voice still felt the need to speak for her. The mere fact that Anne Boleyn was remembered at all, despite an organized effort to erase her, is extraordinary. After her death, Henry VIII moved swiftly to obliterate her presence. Her arms were stripped from buildings. Her portraits disappeared from court galleries. Her name was not to be spoken in polite company. Official histories written under royal patronage rarely mentioned her. When they did, she was cast in one of two roles: the seductress who brought down a kingdom, or the heretic queen who got what she deserved. Yet the public didn't forget. In secret, they speculated. In quiet corners, they whispered. As time passed, Anne Boleyn took on a curious kind of cultural afterlife. During Elizabeth I's reign, the Queen made no public declarations about her mother. She did not declare her a martyr. She did not restore her titles. But she did surround herself with those loyal to the Boleyn name. She kept Anne's cousin Catherine Carey close at court. She commissioned work from poets and musicians who hinted never too loudly at maternal influence. Elizabeth ruled alone, but she ruled in a world still shaped by her mother's absence. And then slowly the tides of history began to shift. The Protestant cause, so intimately bound to Anne's legacy, grew stronger. She became in some circles a symbol of reform, the queen who broke with Rome, who championed the English Bible, who advanced education and humanist learning. These weren't claims made during her lifetime. They were layered on afterward, pieced together from fragments, carefully stitched into a new image by historians who wanted a heroine. Of course, modern scholars know it's never that simple. Anne's role in the Reformation is still debated. Some argue she was a devout reformer, introducing radical books into court and sponsoring scholars who challenged papal authority. Others suggest her interest was more pragmatic, less ideological, a way to carve space for herself in a world that gave women little. The truth, as always, may lie in the middle. But what matters is that the conversation continued. And then came the objects. In the 19th century, an excavation of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. The resting place of Anne Boleyn revealed scattered bones believed to belong to her. There was no monument, no proper grave, no marker of a queen's final rest. Just a slab of marble laid years later bearing her name at last. It wasn't much, but it was something. A whisper carved in stone centuries late. Later still, in the early 20th century, popular culture took up her name again. Novels, plays, and films reimagined Anne in 1,000 ways, victim, villain, visionary. Each version told us more about the age that produced it than about Anne herself. But even in distortion, there was something affirming Anne Boleyn had become unforgettable. She was a question that wouldn't stop being asked. And what a question she remains. How does a woman so thoroughly discarded by power become one of history's most recognizable names? How does a queen with no crown, no tomb, and no defenders still echo through the centuries? Maybe because Anne was never just one thing. She was educated in the courts of Burgundy in France, fluent in Latin, French, and theology. She was ambitious, yes, but also brilliant, witty, and politically savvy. She understood image long before Instagram charm, long before spin. She gave Henry a daughter when he wanted a son. And perhaps most dangerously of all, she never stopped speaking. Even in her final moments, Anne Boleyn did something extraordinary. On the scaffold, she did not beg. She did not accuse. She praised the king. She smiled. And in doing so, she wrested back the narrative. She denied her enemies the satisfaction of her tears. Her composure, described by witnesses as saintly, became its own kind of legend. In later centuries, feminists would rediscover Anne Boleyn and find in her the image of a woman punished not just for ambition, but for intelligence. A woman silenced because she asked too many questions, held too many opinions, refused to play the quiet role history demanded. She was reimagined not as a pawn in Henry's game, but as a player who refused to fold. And still, history keeps turning her over like a well-worn coin. In academic journals, in best-selling novels, in late-night YouTube rabbit holes, and bedtime podcasts. Anne Boleyn returns. Not because we agree on who she was, but because we're still trying to understand what her story means. In Hever Castle, her childhood home, there's a tree said to have been planted in her memory. No one knows for sure, but visitors stand under it, take photos, leave flowers. A woman with no grave receives tributes anyway. At the Tower of London, a single bouquet still appears near the date of her execution, left by no one officially acknowledged, by no one formally, but always there. And in schools across England, children still learn her name sometimes, before they can list all 6 of Henry's wives. They remember her not because of the charges, but despite them. Not because of what she lost, but because of how fiercely she stayed in the story. That's the quiet miracle of Anne Boleyn. She left no memoir, no speeches survive. Her letters are few, and yet we still hear her. Not in grand declarations, but in footnotes and family trees, in the rustle of silk imagined behind closed doors. And maybe that's the lesson worth holding on to. That some voices don't need volume to endure. That justice once broken doesn't vanish, it waits. And that sometimes the softest echoes are the ones we carry the longest. You might think a name can fade as quickly as a whisper, especially one carried by a woman who left the world with her hands tied, her voice silenced and her story warped by the victors. But Anne Boleyn's name didn't disappear. It lingered, not loudly, not defiantly, but steadily woven into the quiet corners of history, kept alive not by monuments or triumphs, but by the smallest, softest fragments that refused to vanish. It began in the most unlikely places in embroidery and jewelry, in marginalia scribbled between lines of theology or foreign correspondence. That bee necklace, the one you remember from portraits, it never officially resurfaced. But replicas appeared quietly across time, reinterpreted, echoed, worn by women who likely never knew the full truth behind the letter, but somehow felt drawn to it. Centuries later, it would become a subtle symbol, not of seduction or ambition as her enemies once claimed, but of survival, of voice. Anne's Book of Hours, Those devotional pages she read while imprisoned holds two messages. One is her own handwritten on the back flyleaf, offering a prayer for mercy. The other, far more haunting, is scribbled by her daughter Elizabeth. Decades later, a single Latin phrase written in the same book. Remember me when you do pray that hope doth lead from day to day. A daughter who could not remember her mother's voice still felt the need to speak for her. The mere fact that Anne Boleyn was remembered at all, despite an organized effort to erase her, is extraordinary. After her death, Henry VIII moved swiftly to obliterate her presence. Her arms were stripped from buildings. Her portraits disappeared from court galleries. Her name was not to be spoken in polite company. Official histories written under royal patronage rarely mentioned her. When they did, she was cast in one of two roles: the seductress who brought down a kingdom, or the heretic queen who got what she deserved. Yet the public didn't forget. In secret, they speculated. In quiet corners, they whispered. As time passed, Anne Boleyn took on a curious kind of cultural afterlife. During Elizabeth I's reign, the Queen made no public declarations about her mother. She did not declare her a martyr. She did not restore her titles, but she did surround herself with those loyal to the Boleyn name. She kept Anne's cousin Catherine Carey close at court. She commissioned work from poets and musicians who hinted never too loudly at maternal influence. Elizabeth ruled alone, but she ruled in a world still shaped by her mother's absence. And then slowly the tides of history began to shift. The Protestant cause, so intimately bound to Anne's legacy, grew stronger. She became in some circles a symbol of reform. The Queen who broke with Rome, who championed the English Bible, who advanced education and humanist learning. These weren't claims made during her lifetime. They were layered on afterward, pieced together from fragments, carefully stitched into a new image by historians who wanted a heroine. Of course, modern scholars know it's never that simple. Anne's role in the Reformation is still debated. Some argue she was a devout reformer, introducing radical books into court and sponsoring scholars who challenged papal authority. Others suggest her interest was more pragmatic, less ideological, a way to carve space for herself in a world that gave women little. The truth, as always, may lie in the middle, but what matters is that the conversation continued. And then came the objects. In the 19th century, an excavation of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. The resting place of Anne Boleyn revealed scattered bones believed to belong to her. There was no monument, no proper grave, no marker of a queen's final rest. Just a slab of marble laid years later bearing her name at last. It wasn't much, but it was something. A whisper carved in stone centuries late. Later still, in the early 20th century, popular culture took up her name again. Novels, plays, and films reimagined Anne in 1,000 ways, victim, villain, visionary. Each version told us more about the age that produced it than about Anne herself. But even in distortion, there was something affirming Anne Boleyn had become unforgettable. She was a question that wouldn't stop being asked. And what a question she remains. How does a woman so thoroughly discarded by power become one of history's most recognizable names? How does a queen with no crown, no tomb, and no defenders still echo through the centuries? Maybe because Anne was never just one thing. She was educated in the courts of Burgundy in France, fluent in Latin, French, and theology. She was ambitious, yes, but also brilliant, witty, and politically savvy. She understood image long before Instagram charm, long before spin. She gave Henry a daughter when he wanted a son. And perhaps most dangerously of all, she never stopped speaking. Even in her final moments, Anne Boleyn did something extraordinary. On the scaffold, she did not beg. She did not accuse. She praised the king. She smiled. And in doing so, she wrested back the narrative. She denied her enemies the satisfaction of her tears. Her composure, described by witnesses as saintly, became its own kind of legend. In later centuries, feminists would rediscover Anne Boleyn and find in her the image of a woman punished not just for ambition, but for intelligence. A woman silenced because she asked too many questions, held too many opinions, refused to play the quiet role history demanded. She was reimagined not as a pawn in Henry's game, but as a player who refused to fold. And still, history keeps turning her over like a well-worn coin. In academic journals, in best-selling novels, in late-night YouTube rabbit holes, and bedtime podcasts. Anne Boleyn returns. Not because we agree on who she was, but because we're still trying to understand what her story means. In Hever Castle, her childhood home, there's a tree said to have been planted in her memory. No one knows for sure, but visitors stand under it, take photos, leave flowers. A woman with no grave receives tributes anyway. At the Tower of London, a single bouquet still appears near the date of her execution, left by no one officially acknowledged, by no one formally, but always there. And in schools across England, children still learn her name sometimes, before they can list all 6 of Henry's wives. They remember her not because of the charges, but despite them. Not because of what she lost, but because of how fiercely she stayed in the story. That's the quiet miracle of Anne Boleyn. She left no memoir, no speeches survive. Her letters are few, and yet we still hear her, not in grand declarations, but in footnotes and family trees, in the rustle of silk imagined behind closed doors. And maybe that's the lesson worth holding on to, that some voices don't need volume to endure, that justice once broken doesn't vanish, it waits, and that sometimes the softest echoes are the ones we carry the longest. And so you feel it now, the hush that comes not from silence, but from everything finally being said. You've wandered through cold stone halls and velvet-draped chambers, stood beneath scaffold shadows and candlelit altars, and now at the end of this long and aching journey there's just you, and her, not the queen with the crown, nor the woman with the charges, but the voice that refused to vanish. It's funny how memory works, how a name like Anne Boleyn, spoken only in whispers for generations, can outlive every monarch who tried to erase it. How a woman's gaze from a 16th century portrait can still meet yours across time, her eyes calm, unflinching, and somehow knowing. Perhaps you've noticed something along the way. That the echoes of Anne's life, the real ones, weren't carved in marble or gilded in gold. They were tucked into the folds of old prayer books, hidden in dedications in half-erased letters, in chapel stones worn smooth by footsteps that refused to forget. Maybe like so many others you were expecting something louder. But history often keeps its truest moments quiet. And Anne's legacy, it never needed shouting, just remembering. So breathe, let the tension melt from your shoulders. Let the image of the tower fade softly into candlelight, and feel yourself drifting gently away from it all. The robes, the whispers, the royal games. Let them go. You've walked with a queen who lost her crown but not her voice. And you've seen how a single name, when carried with care, can survive the centuries. Not in defiance, but in grace. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the story settle like dust on old stone. Let the darkness hold you. And rest well, because tomorrow history will wait for you to remember it again. Sleep peacefully.